As a handful of recent Jordan Center events have reminded us, not just because we're working in this part of the world, but even if it was not intended as such, today's session, I think, is all too timely for the really tough times through which we are all living, even if we're not on the front lines of a terrible, unprovoked, senseless war. I'm really, really glad to have a wonderful colleague with us today to return to share some of her work with us. For those of you who have not spent time with her, Vera Tolz is officially the Sir William Mather Professor of Russian Studies at the University of Manchester. She did her early training in classics in St. Petersburg before moving to the UK to receive her doctorate in Russian and East European Studies at the University of Birmingham. She is best known to some of us through a book that I had to go pull off my shelf again, a truly excellent book that came out with Oxford in 2011 called Russia's Own Orient, The Politics of Identity in Oriental Studies in the Late Imperial and Early Soviet Periods. That was the first time that I could have started earlier, as it turns out. It was a book that sent me on to some of Vera's earlier work, another book, among them Russian Academicians and the Revolution, and an extraordinary range of essays and volumes that have appeared since. What stands out to me personally as a reader is just the extraordinary, both erudition, and a word that we should be able to use for all of ourselves, but is, comes and goes in different doses for all of us, which is just an extraordinary probity of scholarship. There's just an incredible integrity to not just the style of the writing, which is wonderfully economical and direct and clear, but also just an incredible sense of backup. You always feel that you're in really good hands with every text of hers that I have read. And because they stood the test of time so well, not least if you're looking at Russian Orientalism, which is an incredibly broad field to which she brought very uncommon clarity, and still is, I think, a book that is still celebrated for very many reasons. Now, here I've set her up in an impossible task, since she's presenting new work, and works in progress are somewhat different. However, over the past 10 years, she has been at work on related issues to what she's going to present today, tracking understandings of Russian media, television, information networks. I think that, of course, leads us to the title of the talk for today, which is Translating Deceit, Disinformation's Hidden Translingual Journey. I hope you'll join me in welcoming Vera Tolz, and that you'll stay for the question and answer a bit after, if you can. Thank you. Vera.
Thank you very much for such a nice, generous introduction, Bruce, and thank you very much for inviting me to present the Jordan Center. As Bruce said, I will be sharing with you something which is not only work in progress, but it's something that is at the very beginning of the development. I'm trying to put together with my colleague, Stephen Hutchings from the University of Manchester, a very broad study of discourses of disinformation, starting from the First World War and bringing it to the present. And I'll share with you today my preliminary thoughts about how to conceive of such a broad project, and also the findings, again, very preliminary, of some of the pilot studies we have done when preparing basically a funding application for this project. When I started to think about the topic, this kind of history of discourses of disinformation, the topic was already very, the theme was already very topical. Now, unfortunately, it has become even more topical in the context of Russia's war against Ukraine. Now, together with Stephen Hutchings, I've been doing, as Bruce said, for the last 10 years, some work on the Russian media. In particular, I was interested in kind of representations of a Russian nation and interethnic relations on particularly Russian broadcast media. And in the context of that earlier work, I worked together with some counter-disinformation units in the UK and in Europe, and of course looked at the broader scholarship on specifically the question of disinformation, a lot of which in the past years have been attributed to Russia. And it became obvious to me that there are some problems with policy analysis of disinformation, counter-disinformation practices in the West, and a lot of scholarship dealing with disinformation. And to just summarize very quickly the key issues, which I think need more reflections than we find in most of the scholarship and policy analysis of disinformation. So it's first of all, it's a confusion between disinformation as a tool of practice of specific political actors, media, and indeed counter-disinformation services, and disinformation as an analytical concept. And there is a problem of using disinformation, it seems to me, as an analytical concept, because first, it's actually is applied to a very wide range of practices. And if we look at what some scholars call current disinformation order or information disorder, we will see that a lot of problematic communication is not about false or true facts. And in particular, because facts themselves can create multiple meanings depending on context. And also what seems credible to one audience might not seem credible to another audience. And that's not relativism. We do not, of course, deny the fact that specific narratives, and basically disinformation, it's not about individual facts, it's usually about narratives, they have varying veracity and very different relationship to facts. But still, sort of narratives depend on context, their reception depends on context, and a lot of what we can classify as disinformation can be selective use of facts which on their own might be correct and misinterpreting the context in which these facts could make sense. And if we, as I'll try to show, if we look at discourses of disinformation, we will see that disinformation is actually a communicative act, which is historically contingent, socio-culturally contingent, and politically contingent. So accusing someone of disinformation, it's also an act of creating identities for the other and for the self. And so when we discuss kind of public discourses of disinformation, we can see that they are created within the zones of intercultural communication. And very often in relation to the examples I'm interested in, it's communication between Russophone and Anglophone audiences in particular, and actors in particular. And so in our project, we want to kind of have this arts and humanities and discursive kind of perspective on disinformation. And then adopting this perspective to see how discourses of disinformation mutate across time, across linguo-cultural divides and geopolitical divides. And then how specific narratives change or not when they cross linguo-cultural boundaries. And then in what discursive contexts particular narratives become or not examples of disinformation. So that's what we were kind of thinking about, broader issues we were thinking about, Stephen Hutchings and I, in designing our new project. Of course, these are all very broad issues, and we needed to kind of narrow down our own focus. And given that we are Russia specialists and the centrality of Russia and also Russia's interface with the West in shaping broader discourses of disinformation, kind of this, our Russian expertise seems very valid. And then we will also kind of narrow down the scope by looking or carefully selecting specific case studies for our analysis, and in terms of linguistic expertise, kind of select languages which are spoken across the regions of particular strategic importance for Russia and importance historically and today. So to Russian and English, we'll add French, German, and Spanish, which we have, Stephen Hutchings and I, between two of us, but also Arabic and Chinese, and we have people who could help us with those languages. In terms of kind of the broader method, we're thinking of using critical discourse analysis to interrogate our sources, and also kind of support this critical discourse analysis with, or application of it, with insights from Begriffsgeschichte. It's a particular kind of approach developed by German scholars to studying history of concepts, or studying history through looking at specific concepts and how they change meaning, and also Cambridge School of Intellectual History. And in terms of our data sets, we'll start with the First World War, and I'll explain later why we start with that specific date. But the most in-depth analysis will be related to sources starting from the 1960s. And that is the period when, on the Soviet side in particular, new kind of sociological and psychological research in kind of manipulation of information start to develop, very much with a kind of looking at what the American adversary was doing. We already start putting together sort of key texts through, for kind of historical, for the period before the start of the 21st century, or actually before the last decade. We are putting together this data sets of texts through corpus-based analysis, and I'll explain again what exactly I mean here, as well as producing kind of a regular research, bibliographical research. And we're very interested in particularly translations of specific texts between English, American texts, and Russian Soviet texts. Then we will look at specific case studies to study trajectories of narratives across linguistic boundaries. And we'll have two historical cases, one of which I'll briefly discuss today, and 5 contemporary cases looking at Russia-specific narratives, global narratives, and defensive and offensive narratives, or those that we can classify as such. Now, how do we know, how do we determine that these narratives are examples of disinformation? In relation to historical cases, we will be talking about particular campaigns, which we now know through earlier, not our own, historical research that were organized by basically Russian intelligence, Soviet intelligence services with a specific purpose of manipulating information and influencing public opinion. But for the contemporary narratives, we decided to use the most comprehensive database of examples of Russian disinformation put together by East-Stratcom task force, and the database is called EU versus Disinfo. Now, that means that the examples of Russian media reports on different platforms, from television to social media, are predefined by counter-disinformation services as disinformation. So it's not our own decision, which is actually absolutely okay, because we're interested in discourses, how discourse around disinformation is created. And East-Stratcom is a key actor in creating EU-based discourse around disinformation, specifically Russian disinformation. As I'll explain very briefly in a moment, this database is itself actually quite problematic, but it is, if anything, good for the kind of questions we want to address. And then finally, we will look at reactions on Twitter by users of this Russian news reports to ascertain, in a way, effectiveness of the attempt of Russian actors to influence the publics. So now I'll share with you the results of our preliminary pilot projects. And the first is a study of the term disinformation, of the history of the term disinformation, using corpus-based analysis, and specifically 4 corpora: the Hansard corpus, which is the corpus of words and terms used in British Parliament, starting from the early 19th century to the present. So that's actually a very comprehensive corpus, which gives you a great insight into kind of political speech in the UK and British context. The corpora of historical and contemporary American English, and the Russian national language corpus. Now, all these 4 corpora are designed according to the same principles, and so they have very similar search engines. And they can create subsets of texts around specific keywords and terms. They can show you the kind of rise and fall in the usage of specific term. per decade, and you can also make searches in relation to specific media, literature or mass media, political speech, and so on. Now, there are, of course, issues with using corpus-based analysis, which I should mention. First, Hansard corpus is comprehensive in terms of what was said in the British Parliament, because it uses all the stenographic reports of all the public speeches MPs had made. But the other corpora are selective. Those compiling them make attempts to be comprehensive, but they never can be. Also, when we have a kind of massive increase in the number of examples in the 21st century, in the Russian National Corpus or contemporary American English corpus, that does not necessarily always tell you that the term has been used so much more. It's simply in the digital age, when you have online sources, those compiling corpora have much easier job finding examples that when they have to go back to and manually look through printed press, for example. Also, when one studies intellectual history with a focus on specific concepts, one should distinguish between a concept and a term. And let's say in our study, broader concept is manipulation of information, deliberate manipulation of information for particular political or, let's say, economic gain. And there are various terms, a whole range of terms, which relate to this concept. And one should study the whole field of terms to understand how the concept and associated practices change. And we haven't done that yet. We looked only at the term disinformation. But as I'll show, the term disinformation basically starts to be used very widely only from the 1980s. That does not mean that practices associated with a concept were not discussed before, but different terms were used, like state propaganda. The Soviets used the term imperialist propaganda, psychological warfare, and so on. So this is, we will study this later, this wider range of terms. Now, if we look at the term disinformation in relation to this and what we find in this four corpora is the following: that the term disinformation in kind of Anglophone sphere emerged in the late 19th century. We have examples from the 1880s of US newspapers in the US accusing each other of disinformation. And then the first usage in the British Parliament is 1901, where a particular MP accused local authorities in Britain of disinformation around particular policy. The Soviet term disinformatia appears later. It's 1923. Some of you might have read in recent media communications and also in academic literature that the term disinformation was coined by the Soviets, specifically by Stalin, and deliberately was designed to make an impression that the reference is to some kind of foreign practice, because it's clearly not a Russian word originally. So this history, which we've heard recently, clearly is wrong, and the term disinformation existed before it was utilized in the Soviet context, when in 1923, the Politburo created or issued an ukaz to create a disinformation bureau. Now, here we have an interesting kind of situation. In the Anglophone context, the term disinformation originated as a term of practice to criticize an opponent. It's somebody else who does disinformation. So it's a negative term. It's the term of othering. Creating an identity for the self as upholder of truth, and an adversary or competitor as a promoter of falsehoods. The Soviets adopted the term for self-description, which was unusual. However, the practice to which they want to refer, the production of basically forgeries to confuse the enemy, was not a new practice. And during World War I, various powers, including the United States and Germany, set up government departments for the production of manipulated information, specifically forgeries, to confuse the enemy. But one can even say that the Soviets used this term to proclaim that they were still upholders of some higher truth, because this Disinformaционное Bureau was supposed to produce forgeries. Produced forgeries that to the effect that the Soviet economy was doing better than it did, and that the Soviet army, Red Army, was more combat ready than it was. In defense, as the Politburo resolution said, in defense of the Soviet state from attempts to Western enemies to strangle the Russian Revolution. So it's supposed to have been a defensive concept on the kind of Soviet part. There were very few usages of the term in Anglophone or indeed Russian context or Russophone, Soviet context, until the 1980s. And why this term emerges in the 1980s, and it's in a way starts replacing the term state propaganda or imperialist propaganda, I would say that there were kind of one particular reason, and it's the appearance of a range of books using this term, first in America, then in the Soviet Union, after the defection of a Soviet bloc agent, actually a Czech intelligence agent to the West, the publication of his book, where he revealed the existence of this disinformation bureau in the Soviet context, and claimed erroneously that it was Stalin who himself in 1943 coined that term. But also a sudden kind of clear increase in usage of the term disinformation, in my view, was connected with two very polarizing votes in the US and the UK. It's the election of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. And these were polarizing elections, leading to very significant political divisions in America and in Britain. And if we look, interestingly, at the use of the term disinformation in the UK Parliament, in the first half of the 1980s, a lot of usage relates to the USSR and the KGB. But from 1985, basically, it's Labour MPs accuse Tories, the Conservatives, of disinformation, and vice versa. So it's, again, external accusations of somebody else. It's an othering function, but it's in relation to internal domestic politics rather than foreign policy. And again, we can explain very easily why 1985 is a divide. It's Gorbachev coming to power and then rapid improvement of the relationship between the Soviet Union and the West. And to some extent, we see the kind of mirroring of this dynamic in Russophone sphere in the Soviet Union in that period. So it's the kind of external other is accused of disinformation until 1984, and then we start having publications talking about KGB disinformation. So again, internal dynamic, political dynamic in the Soviet-Russian context. In the 1990s, again, we have more examples of the use of the term disinformation, and overwhelmingly, this relates to internal politics. So it's a political, internal political adversary who is accused of disinformation. Labour, Tory, Republicans, Democrats, and in Russia, Yeltsin's government creating its own identity and the kind of pro-Yeltsin media in Russia creating their identities in opposition to the Soviet legacy and to, let's say here, of course, the reference to KGB disinformation. And from 2000, we have a massive increase in the number of examples, particularly in the corpus of contemporary American English. But again, one wonders, one has to be careful about comparisons because we're entering here a digital age where examples are much easier to find. And not surprisingly, of course, we have the appearance of the accusations of the disinformation against Russia, a little bit from 2014 in the American context, but more so in 2016, that's a kind of peak of discussion of Russian disinformation. But by 2019, again, the discussion of disinformation becomes a more kind of focused on internal issues, and for instance, Donald Trump, and much less examples relate to Russia. Now, I presume, I haven't looked at the kind of latest developments in the context of Russia's war against Ukraine. There will be probably more examples of specifically Russian disinformation. And the same pattern we see in the Russian national language corpus, in sudden rise of accusations against the West of disinformation in 2015, 2016, so Ukraine, Crimea, and US interference, Russian interference in US elections. But also in the Russian context, interesting, a lot of examples are kind of Russian actors defend themselves against accusations of disinformation. So what we see is very clearly disinformation is a kind of dialogical, communicative term, identity creating term. It's term of othering, usually opponents or competitors from the same political context, or within the same country, within the same society, and occasionally disinformer, the promoter of deceit, becomes a foreign power, in this case, Russia. But that actually comes up quite rarely, as far as these examples of usage suggest. Now, we also sort of conducted a few preliminary case studies, specifically to look how narratives which can be classified as disinformation travel from kind of one political or geopolitical and linguocultural environment to another. And the first case study is a very well-known Soviet campaign around the origins of HIV/AIDS, which Soviet security services and various actors, including journalists, working with this security services, organized between 1985 and 1988. Now, there is a lot of literature, of course, about Soviet campaign, disinformation campaign around the origins of AIDS. So it's specifically the claim that HIV virus had originated in an American military laboratory. But if one looks at basically the same material discussed a lot before, from the perspective we're trying to adopt, kind of new issues, I think, come to the fore and are highlighted. And the first, and again, it's something which is has been not sufficiently acknowledged in a lot of particular activities of Western counter-disinformation units recently, but also in some of the academic literature. And that's the role of the global disinformation, we can say, ecosystem. Because even in the 1980s, so before the digital age, there existed international disinformation networks. So disinformation is not something which can be limited to a specific society. And before the Soviets started their campaign in 1983, already articles start to appear, for instance, in the US gay press, with a speculation around the origins of AIDS in an American military laboratory. And reference were made to actually verify genuine information about various CIA experiments with viruses, but also to examples of some terrible cases of experiments on humans, particular human subjects, again, in the United States. So the Soviets did not invent their conspiracy theory. They plugged, they started the campaign by plugging into a pre-existing kind of network of conspiracy narratives around the origins of AIDS. And that we actually see in most disinformation campaigns sponsored by the states. They are the subject or the idea, the conspiracy theory is not invented by the state agents. They already use pre-existing kind of narratives which have certain salience. And what is it? Then we looked at specific examples where we now know that these articles were produced with the help or by Soviet agents and planted in the media in different countries, from India to Africa, and attempts also were made to plant them in Western newspapers. And we looked at how these narratives were tailored to specific linguocultural and socio-political context. And what is interesting that we took as our kind of data set a very comprehensive bibliography of these publications produced in 1987 by the State Department, whose researchers produced a very kind of detailed and well-informed study of the Soviet disinformation campaign around AIDS. But what is interesting that in this study, there is absolutely not a word about any publications which the Soviets used, cross-referenced, and kind of otherwise utilized, published in the United States. So there is as if there was absolutely no salience for the conspiracy theory in America itself. But in fact, the conspiracy theory originated in America. And that's very typical also for counter-disinformation services and policy research around disinformation today. So one's own country is kind of exempt from the accusation of disinformation. In terms of tailoring narratives to specific linguocultural audiences, we have, for instance, a publication in India, in a newspaper in India, referring to American military laboratories in Pakistan, publications in Russia, in the Soviet Union, aimed at Soviet citizens, Russian-speaking Soviet citizens, specifically talk about how in Nazi Germany, so Western scientists made experiments on humans, and in Africa, where these articles produced by security organs in the Soviet bloc had particular salience, presented as racist, the kind of more accepted, the dominant idea of Western scientists that the origin of HIV/AIDS was in Africa. So that was presented as a sign of racism of Western sciences. So we clearly see this attempt to tailor the narrative so that they would look particularly credible to a specific linguocultural audience. What surprised me in a way when I was rereading recently, now basically, Russian language articles in Soviet newspapers for domestic use in the Soviet Union was how much of this material, how many of these articles and how intensively they referred to Western media or Western experts to validate the claim. And we see the same today, so that there is a perception, even in authoritarian and states with very strong, like in Russia, anti-Western stance, there's perception that Western media have very high credibility. And so their validation is sort of sought in order, validation of Western actors is sought to improve the credibility of the narrative supported by a kind of authoritarian actor. And finally, we see that the level of public attention to disinformation campaign depends on a wider political context. Look at the dates of the Soviet campaign around the origins of HIV/AIDS. It's 1985, 1988. And behind the scene, we know that the American side raised this issue of this campaign with Gorbachev, who personally ordered the end of the campaign. But there hardly seemed to have been a public debate or public concern about this campaign, because that's the period in the West, because that's the period, or in the British Parliament, because that's the time when the relationship between the Soviet Union and the UK and America are improving. Now, we also conducted two case studies which relate to contemporary disinformation narratives, and that around the COVID-19 pandemic. As I said, for the contemporary studies, our original data set were reports from the EU versus Disinfo database. And we did content analysis of the reports themselves, and also Istratcom produces kind of statements with their own explanation of why these examples are pieces of disinformation. So the rationale for inclusion in the database. We analyzed those as well. Then we increased the data set with the use of digital research platform Issue Crawler. We created a larger set of reports on the specific COVID-related issues, on the news outlets from which the original examples in EU versus Disinfo came. Then we also used this open access Hypha tool to see which sources are hyperlinked in the data set. So that would help us to see how what is originally perceived as disinformation circulates again in the translingual, transnational media space. And finally, we also look at social media reactions of users to selected reports. So the first case study related to COVID was around the use of chloroquine, the malaria drug, as a remedy against COVID. And if you remember that originally there was a hope that this cheap drug could be effective, and of course Trump endorsed it, but then the study, which was originally seemed promising, was discredited, and licenses or regulations about use of chloroquine to treat COVID were withdrawn. So the EU versus Disinfo had 4 reports around this issue from Russia-related outlets. Southfront, and all these outlets, I should say, produce reports in multiple languages. most languages of the European Union, and of course English, Russian, but also some Asian languages and Middle Eastern languages. These 4 reports from 3 different media organizations, and the media organizations are of different nature. Southfront is a site probably affiliated with the Kremlin. It produces kind of pro-Kremlin information alongside conspiracy theories. So it's a very, very kind of poor quality outlet. But it's not directly funded by the Russian state. Maybe it receives, or the people running it get some perks from the Kremlin, but it's not directly funded by the Kremlin. And then Sputnik and RT, which are in different languages, which are state-funded outlets. Then we increase the sample with issue crawler by looking at all reports on Sputnik, Southfront, and RT, which mention chloroquine. And some of these reports could have been included in EU versus Disinfra database, but they were missed because they clearly were kind of had very dubious claims, and others were simply factual, unproblematic reports. And then our work, hyperlink network analysis, produced 600 kind of further publications to which this original reports in the original sample reference. And then we used user engagement of Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, and comments made on these outlets or platforms. And so what do we find then? The reports in EU versus Disinfo database indeed showed poor standards of journalistic practice, but of different kind. One had a sensational title, which was problematic, which did not correspond to the report itself, which was factual and seemed unproblematic. 2 from RT America and Southfront promoted unsubstantiated, widely discredited conspiracy theory. And one from RT International, from Sputnik, one could describe as a partisan, biased reporting. So very different practices are classified with the umbrella term of disinformation. And one wonders how sort of useful is that. But also the EU versus Disinfo disproof reports also lacked necessary rigor. They didn't summarize properly these publications. And again, the evidence base for disproof of the investigated stories was also questionable. And that is important because, again, from our point of view, from point of view of questions we ask, because, for instance, RT published or produced quite a significant range of reports about poor quality of EU versus Disinfo database. And some of RT's criticism was valid, others was not, but EU versus Disinfo stuff tended to include RT's complaints about EU versus Disinfo as further examples of RT disinformation. So you see clearly discourse of disinformation is produced in this dialogue of accusations and counter accusations. And then we see here different type of sources, hyperlinked, South Front, regularly hyperlinked, very questionable Russian or US, basically conspiracy sites. And we see a clear collaboration with this Russian affiliated disinformation actors and America's, particularly alt-right websites. And RT and Sputnik tend to sort of use more kind of reputable sources, but use them selectively, quote them again out of context, and produce skewed narratives through, let's say, more sophisticated means, less crudely than South Front. But at the same time, South Front very often hyperlinked articles in RT and Sputnik, but not vice versa. So language-related differences. Sputnik, in particular, had a number of reports in Russian and Georgian languages, and they covered, the Sputnik in Russian and Georgian covered the drug affair at the peak of the controversy, and then drastically reducing the coverage after the disapproval of the drug's effectiveness. South Front did not cover the topic in Russian and German, covered in French and, or Georgian, sorry, it's a typo in Georgian, but covered in German and in English and French. In English and French language, on RT, on South Front and Sputnik, there was much wider coverage of the affair. The coverage continued after the disapproval of the effectiveness of the drug, and it then shifted to criticism, quite habitual of these outlets, of policymaking of Western institutions, policymaking of pharmaceutical industry, and of on South Front and RT America op-eds, outright conspiracy theories were promoted. So quite different, we have quite different coverage on Russian and Georgian and English and French. And in particular, in relation to Russian, kind of our wider research suggests that from 2020, the Russian media attempted to cover COVID-related issues quite responsibly because of the major concern of the spread of the pandemic in the country. But in Anglophone and French-speaking environments, sort of dubious narratives continue to, of course, to be promoted. Language-related difference in terms of audience engagement. There were some common themes, which of course are very salient on Twitter or Facebook anyway. There's mistrust in the media and political institutions in the West, questioning of how different governments responded to the pandemic, but also questioning of RT and Sputnik in terms of their trustworthiness and credibility. Not surprisingly, English language sources engage most linguistically diverse audiences, and a lot of responses on Twitter and Facebook to this English, the reports in English were in other languages, from Vietnamese to Kurdish to Arabic, and of course various other European languages in addition to English. And a lot of links, including to very questionable information providers or outright disinformation providers in multiple languages in these audience responses. Russophone users were also quite distinct. And the distinction was, interestingly, that there was a very high proportion of the criticism of the Russian government among particular Twitter responses to RT Sputnik and South Front. But there were no personal attacks on Putin, but kind of general criticism of Russian authorities' handling of the pandemic. I think I've spoken for too long, so I'll leave the next case and come to the conclusions. So from all this kind of different and not necessarily coherently put together comments and thoughts I've been having about how we can better study disinformation, I'll kind of list a few key points. So we need to distinguish disinformation as a term of practice from disinformation as an analytical concept. And as a term of practice, disinformation is dialogical, discursive attempt to create a particular identity for the self and for the other, and it has a tendency to externalize the blame for producing poor information and sometimes project kind of anxieties about information disorder onto a political opponent or a competitor, either within the same society or more often or occasionally in relation to foreign adversaries. So it's a kind of dialogical, performative concept, and that makes it problematic as an analytical concept. And the kind of, I would say, ineffectiveness of most counter-disinformation units today, I think partly come from the fact that their working principles have a very simplistic understanding of disinformation, of something which is true or false, verifiably, easily verifiably, and something which is perceived or should be perceived as true or false universally in every society, irrespective of the specific context. But in fact, I think the reality is different. So disinformation works as a narrative, usually not a specific false or true fact. And what is perceived as deceit or truth varies enormously depending on the context, and also changes temporarily. And the context can be cultural, linguistic, and also political, of course. And if we compare the past campaign, the Soviet disinformation campaign, and current Russian examples of disinformation as defined by the EU versus Disinfo database, we see similarities and differences. The similarities in the past and now are that usually specifically organized disinformation campaign probably inserts itself in pre-existing disinformation networks and takes narratives which are salient within these networks, rather than, let's say, intelligence agents somewhere coming up with their own ideas. There is a clear attempt to tailor narrative to specific audiences depending on the linguocultural context, and it's surprising how actually limited research on this specific topic is. Again, I'm struck by this, how authoritarian actors and media actors seek validation from Western media, from Western sources. And the difference are, of course, one obvious observation, it's the ease and speed of dissemination of any kind of information or disinformation today. There is much broader scope for translingual remediation of information or disinformation. The current kind of media networks and disinformation networks are more complex, more translational, more translingual today than they were in the past. We have a capacity of disinformation actors for a much wider audience reach, and we have a more diverse and large set of actors. And again, audiences become themselves or users of particular sites, and platforms become producers of information or disinformation in their own right. But also, if we look at the kind of country like Russia, in these campaigns organized by the Kremlin, we have not only kind of intelligence agents or actors paid by the state participating, or directly paid by the state, like RT and Sputnik participating, but also we can call them freelancers who are kind of seeking approbation from the Kremlin and the benefits. And that, of course, makes, or this new environment makes a kind of counter-disinformation actions much more difficult than before. So I've spoken for too long already. I'll stop at that, and thank you very much for listening.
Thanks so much, Vera. All right. Well, look, then I will start. But again, I'll keep it brief, and I'll also feel free to interrupt Vera if we have another question coming in from the audience, because I always think that's the sacred trust that the audience has been quiet for a while and can join in. The things that I took from this, right? This is what's so important about this topic, I understand, and why I was excited about your presenting it, is that it's all around us, and everyone is in so many different contexts are trying to get a handle on it for different reasons. And I'm thinking of historical elements here that you've presented us with. I'm thinking of translingual elements, and we could pursue either of those. But the question I really have is, I think you kind of are implying this, but with the attention to disinformation as a focus of othering, I guess I'm just asking if when you and Stephen have been doing this kind of close reading of these texts, does it matter? Is the information, right? After announcing, we start with the leveraging of the negative energy, right? The announcement of the disinformation as a point of shame or immorality or strategy and realpolitik, fine. But I was so curious as you kept going to know if it's the preponderance of whether it's followed immediately by the correct information, or whether that's kind of auxiliary or unnecessary, or at least not found as often as you expected.
Yeah, that is a very good question. Sort of basically, as I had understood, how do you kind of counter disinformation? Do you need to immediately provide kind of good information? And the problem here is that, again, that's not our research, but actually other people's research around kind of wider issues with media communication today, is that by attempting to disprove disinformation, and particularly through kind of correcting facts, one gives, in a way, further publicity to the problematic narrative.
Right.
And that is a major problem, which again is a problem for counter-disinformation units. What do? Because by kind of correcting the mistake, you might not necessarily change people's opinion, but remind them of the original mistake in which they kind of wanted to believe for whatever reason. But I think the main, again, I was recently asked, well, last week actually, to speak at UK Parliament about Russian disinformation now in relation to Ukraine. And there was a broader question about what we do, how we improve media literacy, or how we improve kind of defenses against disinformation. And to be honest, I think that it is very difficult to find the answer, and for various reasons. But to me, two reasons stand kind of out very clearly. The first is what I already mentioned, that disinformation is not so much about facts. It is the best disinformation is when one uses correct facts, but uses them selectively to create a skewed narrative and takes facts out of context or puts them in the wrong context. And I'll give you again an example, very recent example related to Russia and Ukraine. It so happens that basically all of my friends and colleagues in Russia are very much against the war. Some are very brave in attempting to oppose what is going on. And I was asked through my friend who is an academic, by a very brave Russian politician. He's a member of the St. Petersburg City Council or City Duma, who has been very critical of Putin's regime for many years, and now he's protesting against the war. And this City Duma deputy asked for a comment from someone with the kind of historical expertise on the historical narrative produced by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Russia, claiming that in Ukraine there is this strong tradition of Nazism. And what this critic of Putin from the Russian St. Petersburg City Duma thought was that a historian could say, this fact is wrong, this fact is wrong, this fact is wrong, and this fact is wrong. Anyway, this text produced by the Foreign Ministry, Russian, came to me. And what I could see that a lot of facts were correct. There were, let's say, reference to two historical figures whose views we now will find abhorrent. They were anti-Semitic, they were racist, or whatever. But the context was totally false, because in that particular period, what society do you have where such people didn't exist? You know, racism was so widespread, anti-Semitism was so widespread. What's specific about Ukraine? But the whole point was Ukraine had this specific kind of obsession with Nazi ideology. Then and so on. So the facts were but the narrative was totally false. That's already a problem. So how do you deal with that? How you improve media literacy when understanding disinformation very often requires a very broad historical knowledge. And so what I said in the parliament is that my main takeaway from years of assessing the validity of information is how little I know. So basically, to acknowledge that we don't know something, that we don't have expertise to pass judgment over the particular narrative, is not a weakness, it's a strength.
I'm going to interrupt here just for a second. I love all of this, and you're reminding me of some good apothegms about the best lie is the truth just slightly retold. But we have 3 great questions in the chat that I'm paid to monitor here. And I want to make sure I know that for some people, 10 minutes is the witching hour. So I'm just going to read all 3 questions, and then you might take them one by one if you like. The first one came in from Karen Rosenberg, who's with us as Zoom user. She's asking about explaining the shift in popularity from the term propaganda to the term disinformation. Do you have a hypothesis to offer which you will try to confirm about this, or at least about the shift? So the first one is propaganda to disinformation. The second one is from Volha Verbilovic. Can we say the term fake news is produced and reproduced selectively through counter narratives the same way that disinformation does? So again, it's a comparison of terms, fake news and disinformation. Are we looking at the same dynamics? And the second, it's great to see Lynn Patik briefly a little before with us is D37075. We all have alter egos here. She's asking, could we talk about the relationship of disinformation narratives and conspiracy theories? So again, and then she asks further, are you going to explore generic features of disinformation narratives and so forth? So again, propaganda, fake news, and conspiracy. I leave it to you.
Yeah, okay. So why first the term disinformation start having greater salience than propaganda? First, I think I need to study the use of the word propaganda more than I have done so far. I haven't actually done much study of the term propaganda. But as I mentioned, probably too briefly, that I think that the term disinformation kind of re-entered or start to be used widely in political discourses, particularly in America and the US in the 1990s, in connection with the publication of a book by a Soviet defector, Ladislav Bitman, it was Czech defector from the Soviet bloc, and he was an intelligence officer who, in his book, revealed the activities of what originally in 1923 was called the Disinformation Bureau in Moscow. And he claimed that the whole concept of disinformation and even the term were the Soviet invention. And of course, in the context of the Cold War, that had resonance and salience. Hence, the emergence of this, or the proliferation of the use of the term disinformation. That seems to be kind of the explanation. Again, fake news, it's the term which is, according to the corpus of historical American English, also originated in the US press in the late 19th century, and seem to have been used in a very similar, kind of with a similar meaning to disinformation. And fake news, again, is a very problematic term, as is disinformation, as a term of analysis, because it's broad, it's used for all sorts of purposes, including by Trump, and it's a term of practice, it's polemical, it's dialogical, it's othering. So in that sense, I think it is very similar in meaning and usage to the term disinformation. Now, conspiracy theory, I would say it's something more specific than disinformation. Again, there is a whole literature about what is conspiracy theory, how you understand it, because again, somebody's conspiracy theory is another person's kind of common sense. What passes as conspiracy theory for most people in Western democracy would seem very plausible to some audiences in the Middle East, for instance. But usually the scholars who try to use the term as an analytical tool say that conspiracy theory is a theory as an explanation and belief that something is not like it seems. There are kind of hidden forces working in the background. And at the time of articulation, there shouldn't be sufficient evidence to back up claims of some secret nefarious actions. Later on, conspiracy theory could turn out to be true. But what's important for analytical purposes is at the time of use, there is no evidence. And I would say that so defined, conspiracy theory is one of the examples of narratives which we can describe as disinformation.
Okay, well, look, then I will nod to our witching hour, and not least because our excellent guest deserves to have a glass of wine now and dinner not soon after. It's really a pleasure again, Vera. Thank you so much. It really, it's a handle on things that we all need, but I learned some good things, and I'll probably send an email on this front too. So I want to thank everyone for joining us. And if you haven't seen it yet, please read the good books. And I'll look forward to finding some of you again, I hope soon, on the screen, and maybe even, I hate to say it, in real life settings somewhere soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for very good questions.